Welcome to the 12th and final podcast in this LRB close reading series on satire with me, Claire Bucknell.
And with me, Colin Burrow. Final it's not a good word, is it, really?
It's a very sad word, but all good things must come to an end. And today we are going to go out on a high.
Yep.
Because we've talked a lot about men in this series, haven't we, Colin?
Yeah, all of them have been men apart from Jane Austen, I think.
Yep. But I think we don't necessarily need to feel too bad about that.
Well, I'm glad it was you who said that, not me. Okay, but there we go.
Well, the reason I say that is there are a lot of features of satire historically that have marked it as stereotypically male. So the general fuck you all attitude that the satirist takes to the world is one that, until very recently, women couldn't adopt, certainly not publicly.
And I think we're the poorer for it, aren't we? And I suppose, too, the imagined readership of satire tends to be homosocial. I mean, that is, the satirist summons like-minded blokes to laugh at what he finds contemptible or funny. And there's some satire, I suppose Rochester's in particular, which you could almost see as a version of a male bonding rite, really. You bring men together to share the same hatreds, the same social contempts, often the same overt misogyny as well. Join this outrageous band of brothers if you dare. It's that kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, gross.
Yeah.
And a few of the male writers we've talked about have created these ostentatious personae for themselves, haven't they? These sort of sexually active.
Well, sexually hyperactive, really.
Yeah, okay, sexually hyperactive, transgressive figures. So thinking of Byron or Wilde or Rochester. Again, not really a posture open to women historically.
Yeah, and I suppose one version of the history of British satire would be that, from about the 18th century onwards, satire gets gradually swallowed up, almost taken over by the emergence of the personality of the satirist, the big shouting man.
Well, and I'm glad you said 18th century. Because,
oh, God, I've really let myself into it there, haven't I? Yeah.
Well, we're down this road now. Give me a chance to mention my favourite satirist, whom I have been forbidden to talk about during the series because people won't have heard of him.
Well, I will permit you, since this is our very last episode.
Thank you. It's almost Christmas. Charles Churchill, the other Churchill, was the most famous satirist of the age during the later 18th century. And he is an extremely good example of this big satirist personality or big satire energy effect, because he was technically a vicar, but he nonetheless liked to strut around London in a gold-laced hat and attend orgies with women dressed as nuns at the Hellfire Club in Buckinghamshire.
So Byron before Byron, really. I suppose you heard it here first, folks. Charles Churchill, the ultimate origin of English satire.
Exactly. But yes, I take your general point about, the personality of the satirist. In the olden days, satirists...
I don't think I can let you get away with the olden days there. How about the early modern period? Because we obviously know when the early modern period was, wasn't it? It was back then.
All right, if you want to get technical about it. Yeah, so you're saying that in the early modern period, satirists generally became satirists because they wanted to attack social or political or ecclesiastical evils, of the kind we talked about in relation to Erasmus, his praise of folly, or Donne's satires, or Pope's Dunciad. But then, later, some of that gets overwritten by the, big drama of just being a satirist or being decadent and wicked, which becomes sort of the point in itself. But I guess, you can trace that right back to John Donne, can't you?
Yeah. He creates the big biting satirist persona. And you can see that the legacy of all that still today, I think. The most visible contemporary satirists tend to be, I suppose, people like Frankie Boyle.
Who is a very outspoken Scottish comedian for our overseas listeners, whose stock in trade is sort of saying outrageous things. And his act is as much about performance and the persona of being Frankie Boyle as it is about the social critique.
And as we suggested, that isn't the kind of social or literary role that women could comfortably occupy until really quite recently. So Joan Rivers, perhaps, or maybe Ruby Wax, only started doing that kind of satirical performance, I suppose, during my lifetime.
The 1880s.
Absolutely, yeah. It's been going on for that long. Yeah.
But we're going to end the series today by discussing a woman novelist and satirist of the 20th century.
Yeah, and this episode is on Muriel Spark, who was born in 1918 and died in 2006. And we're going to talk about her novel A Far Cry from Kensington, which was published in 1988 when, Claire, I was even younger than you, and I believe you weren't even born.
That's correct. I don't know if that's actually helped you. So Spark is an interesting example of someone who's often said to write satirically, but who probably wouldn't have described herself as a satirist.
Yeah, so we're back with satire as an adjective or an adverb as much as a noun. And I suppose most people would know Muriel Spark as the author of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, which is a loosely autobiographical novel from 1961 about an Edinburgh schoolmistress and the ways in which she tries to improve the girls in her charge.
Whom she calls repeatedly the creme de la creme.
Yes, very good Scottish accent.
Thank you.
And she improves them in ways that are variously controlling and liberating and a bit sad. And eventually, well, her regrettable love of Mussolini is betrayed by one of them, which enables her hostile headmistress to sack her. And it was an incredibly successful novel and an even more successful film in 1969 and was one of Maggie Smith's best roles. I think it was the first one she won an Oscar for, wasn't it?
Yeah. And its success, I think, somewhat drowned out the rest of Spark's work, which is amazingly varied. She wrote more than 20 novels.
And loads of very good short stories as well, all of which were extraordinarily different. So, she wrote one novel, which was more or less a straight satirical roman à clef about the Watergate scandal, which was called The Abbess of Crewe.
And that is set in a nunnery in which there's a battle over who's going to be chosen as the next abbess. And the current abbess has her junior nuns bugged. As
they do. So it's basically Nixon in a wimple, isn't it? I mean, that's what The Abbess of Crewe is. But she could also write novels that took genre fiction, the horror story, the detective story in particular, and sort of turn them inside out. So the novel she regarded, I think, as her best, The Driver's Seat of 1970, is a murder mystery which is told from a very odd angle because it's about a woman who wants to arrange her own murder and leaves all sorts of deliberate clues behind her as she goes off to get herself killed.
Yeah. The woman as murder victim is a sort of recurrent theme in several of the short stories as well. There's one called Portobello Road, which is about a girl called Needle, and she's called that because she once found a needle in a haystack and she ends up murdered in another haystack.
Where she's eventually found, hence Needle in a haystack, yeah.
Yeah, which is a kind of typically Spark bitter joke.
Gruesome,
and it's it's narrated from Needle's point of view because she's now a ghost. And before the passage in which she describes her own death, she delivers the very Spark line, "He looked as if he would murder me, and he did."
Yeah, so there's no comma there, no semicolon, and he did. Run on, just casual. Boom, she's dead. And I think that sort of dry spring of surprise is very much what Spark did. And so's the almost callous joke, really, about the needle, the body in the haystack. And also, actually, too, is the preoccupation with ghosts, because there's another novel called The Hot House on the East River, which is one I really like, actually, which is more or less uncategorizable. And a lot of reviewers, when it came out, didn't really know what to make of it in 1973. But it's about a group of oddballs who live in an overheated apartment in hip 1970s New York, who keep thinking that they see spies and fragments of their past from the 1940s all around them. And they turn out to be ghosts, all of them.
We'll come back to the immediate post-war period in a minute, won't we?
Yeah, because A Far Cry from Kensington is set very precisely in 1954 to 5.
Yeah. But we should say at this point that during the war, Spark worked for a time in a government department that used German spies to spread propaganda in Germany.
Right, and she used telephonic scrambling devices and stuff like that. So her interest in spying and secrets and misinformation, which emerged in that period, I think remained a big element throughout her work. And it's partly why in her writing in general and in A Far Cry in particular, the word plot often means not just, the story of the novel, but also a set of mysterious conspiracies or attempts by persons unknown to manipulate her characters. She tends to embed her characters in plots which they don't quite understand and can't quite piece together.
Yeah, and her readers too, because reading Spark is, like being stuck in a plot that you can't quite grasp. She gives you just enough information to make you feel that something is going on and you ought to understand what it is, but not enough so that you actually do.
Yeah, and she does that repeatedly. So in the Ballad of Peckham Rye, there's a guy called Dougal Douglas who creates chaos around him and who may or may not be the devil. But neither the people in the book nor readers of the book can be quite sure, although he does have some funny lumps on his head.
Which are always significant.
Yeah, never trust a man with lumps on his head, I say. Yeah.
Sorry to men with lumps on their heads. But but this interest in misdirection, I think, is key, and it marks her out from the major novelists of the generation just before her, such as Evelyn Waugh, whom we talked about last time, and Graham Greene.
Yeah, both of whom actually warmly supported her early in her career. I mean, Greene sent her money and wine, which was nice, and Waugh was consistently generous in his praise of her books. And you couldn't say that Waugh was consistently generous about anything very much, apart from Muriel Spark. But I think Waugh and Greene, well, unlike Spark, when you pick up a novel by them, you tend to know what kind of thing it's going to be. You know, you'll get morally compromised wannabe good spies in Greene, and you'll get lost souls in Worlds Gone Mad in Waugh with jokes. Whereas with Spark, I think you really genuinely couldn't predict what she's going to write about next. And I think it's that unpredictability which means that she ought to be regarded as highly as any British novelist from the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, she's hard to pin down, but she does have a distinctive angle on the world, doesn't she?
Yeah, but it is a bit hard to describe, and perhaps even to call it a distinctive angle on the world might be slightly misleading, because the main feature of her novels is that she likes to surprise you or keep you guessing. And she did have a really long career during which she changed quite a bit.
Yeah, so she began her writing life in the 40s as a poet, and being a poet and how awful it is to be a poet feature in her great novel, The Girls of Slender Means of 1963. And she also had somewhat miserable and contentious time working on the Poetry Review, of which she became the editor.
Before she was sacked, yeah.
Yeah.
And in the 1980s, when she wrote A Far Cry from Kensington, she seems to have been fascinated by that phase of her life in the sort of late 40s, early 50s. So her novel Loitering with Intent of 1981 basically transforms the Poetry Society and its personnel into a community of blackmailing biographers.
Yeah, that's probably my favourite of the novels. And again, it has that effect of a plot or a conspiracy that you don't quite understand or you can't see the edges of, uniting an apparently random group of people.
Yeah. So she had that grim decade or so in the world of books, which is what a character in The Girls of Slender Means calls the literary world, a very good phrase for it. And her life in the later 40s and 50s, when she was struggling to make a living by writing, I think really was a formative nightmare in her life. You know, she spent her days with predatory men and daft or corrupt male publishers who were all supported by clever women who were stuck in relatively lowly clerical roles. And that shape of career, I think, was really important for her.
Yeah. So she writes her first novel, The Comforters, in 1957, and it's the story of a woman who keeps hearing the novel that she's in being typed, which I think is a lovely conceit.
It really is brilliant. And it sets up, I suppose, that idea that we're all stuck in a plot that we don't understand. We're being typed by someone else, as it were.
Yeah. And it was also an autobiographical novel. So in 1954, Spark had a delusional interlude as a result of taking too much Dexedrine, which is a drug she'd been on to lose weight. And we should say here that the weight and size of women in particular was something that she was unusually conscious of and sensitive to. So in The Girls of Slender Means, for instance, slender refers both to the girls' poverty, you know, their slender wallets, and their physicality.
Yeah, and ultimately only the girls who are physically slender enough are able to escape from a bomb-damaged hostel using a variety of lubricants to slither out through the bathroom window, just to deliver a massive spoiler for the plot. But we won't reveal who actually gets out and who doesn't.
We will not, no.
No, read the book.
And in A Far Cry from Kensington, the plot, in both senses of that word, as we'll see, centres around weight loss. So the heroine, Mrs. Hawkins, who's always called Mrs. Hawkins, starts eating only half of everything she's offered, and so she appears to be wasting away. So in Spark, body mass is a big plot issue.
Right. And I think it's only a small exaggeration to say that Spark's own use of dexedrine to lose weight effectively kick-started her career as a novelist, because her breakdown, precipitated by taking the drug, which led to her conversion to Catholicism during her recovery, also led to her writing The Comforters. And it was a really proper technicolor mental breakdown too. I mean, under the influence of the drug, she began seeing secret messages encoded in the poems and plays of T.S. Eliot.
I mean, who amongst us has not?
Well, they're sort of written in order to make you see those things, aren't they? Yeah. But I mean, these were messages specifically addressed to Muriel Spark and threatening her. And what came next, if you will indulge me, Claire, is a curious coincidence in the history of British satire, because after her breakdown, Spark converted to Roman Catholicism and sought refuge at a Carmelite retreat in Allington Castle in Kent. Now, back in the 16th century...
Here we go again.
Yeah, back in the 16th century, Allington Castle was the family home of none other than Sir Thomas Wyatt, who in the 1530s had written some of the very first verse satires based on Horace in English. So Allington Castle is then where Spark started to write The Comforters. Coincidence? Definitely not.
Thanks for listening to this extract from On Satire, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.